Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be another lecture in our series where we're starting to look at types of governments and their responses to terrorism. So, today we're really going to focus on democracies, how they respond to terrorism, why terrorism emerges in democracies, and what really are the consequences are for terrorism in democracies. We first have to think about why do terrorist groups emerge and persist in democracies. And so one of the first ideas we'll get at here is the idea of unaddressed grievances. And this is the idea that there are particular groups, even in democratic countries, that don't think that the system will work in a way that they're able to actually have their desires met. And we can see this as a good example with the example of the ETA in Spain. This is a group that operates in the Basque Country, very, very small region of northern Spain, and they often feel that the Spanish government doesn't necessarily recognize their particular interests and concerns. And even though Spain is a democracy, they still feel that they're oppressed, and in some ways they have certain reasons to believe that. In the 1980s, when Spain was a democracy, they were willing to use violent, bloody tactics to try to repress them. But for the most part, we see this unaddressed grievances idea can still emerge in democracies, even when various groups in a society have a greater voice. And we can see this also, this unaddressed grievances feeds into the idea of a lack of representation as well. And this gets at the idea that when groups don't feel that they have adequate representation in government, they're willing to potentially engage in violent tactics and engage in terrorism, and then continue to use terrorism as a tactic when they continue to believe they don't have adequate representation. And this we can see in some ways fits with the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, has always felt that it was underrepresented in the United Kingdom's government. Northern Ireland is a very small region of the United Kingdom, and they've always felt underrepresented in their political interests as well as with their ultimate goal of reuniting with Ireland. They just felt like they haven't had the opportunity in many ways to have the representation they need to achieve their political goals. And this has helped fuel their willingness to continue to engage in terrorism. And then finally, we also run into the situation where sometimes various terrorist groups are simply incompatible with the idea of democracy. We think of the Ku Klux Klan, racist, white supremacist organization, primarily now operates in the American South, but does have branches all across the United States. Their worldview is simply not compatible with the idea of democracy, where we ensure equality, liberty, freedoms for all groups of people. Everyone has the right to vote. Everyone is equal. These are foundational principles in a democracy, and the Ku Klux Klan's white supremacist ideology in many ways simply can't coincide with that particular form of government. But as we see here from the quote of the former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, she says, democracy is necessary to peace and to undermining the forces of terrorism. And we'll think about this in terms of how democracy may be a bulwark against terrorism. We still see terrorist groups operate in democracies, but perhaps democracies are a hope for us to combat terrorism and ensure that fewer groups are willing to use it as a political tactic. So, now let's think about what are the concerns that democracies face when combating terrorism. Well, to combat terrorism, it often leads us to the idea that we need to increase security. But we often think about the fact that increased security may lead to trade-offs in terms of civil liberties and civil rights. So what are civil liberties and civil rights? So democracies aim to protect these. Civil liberties we think about as our political freedoms that prevent the government from becoming tyrannical and oppressing us in our everyday lives. And when we think about civil rights, this is where we think about the idea of the government protecting individuals from discrimination by the government and by other individuals. But we can run into some tensions when we increase security based on what we might see as trade-offs with civil liberties and civil rights. And so your first discussion question I want you to think about is, so this is discussion question 1, how does the need for increased security conflict with civil liberties and civil rights? So discussion question 1, how does the need for increased security conflict with the idea of civil liberties and civil rights? My apologies if you can hear my dog barking in the background. This is one of the unfortunate features of online lectures and working at home. So let's move to the next step. So what are some of the limits that democracies face when combating terrorism? Well, when we think about democracies, right, we think democracies are supposed to respect human rights, respect civil liberties, respect civil rights, and this limits the capacity that they have to combat terrorist groups. They are not supposed to torture. They are not supposed to detain without a warrant. They're not supposed to kill people without having gone through a trial and perhaps ultimately get a death penalty from a jury of their peers. Democracies are supposed to respect human rights, and this limits the repressive tactics they can use to try to stop terrorist organizations from operating. And in many ways, also, democracies face difficulties trying to combat terrorist organizations because they allow freedom of speech, right? In the United States, we allow groups and individuals to basically say what they think. We have no means of stopping what a lot of people describe as hate speech in the United States. Hate speech is the idea of speech that targets, belittles, demeans, is seen as what quote unquote repressive to particular groups. The United States Constitution does not prevent hate speech. And so groups like the Ku Klux Klan can express their horrific ideologies without being stopped by the central government. And so this perhaps allows these groups to continue to operate and function and get their message out there when otherwise they might not be able to, because they have constitutional protection, civil liberties for free speech. And so when we see something like an example of this, we see with the FARC, what was considered a terrorist organization in Colombia in South America. The Democratic government of Colombia was supposed to respect human rights, could not simply bomb, destroy, wipe out these particular groups in a lot of respects because they had to respect individual rights. And there's a number of instances in Colombia where the government violated these laws, these rights of individuals, but for the most part, the democratic government is supposed to respect these ideas. So let's think about what are some of the effects of terrorism in a democracy. And we're going to look at two different lists of potential effects. So the first one we see is that in a lot of ways, terrorist attacks lead to increased intolerance. So as you can see here from this picture, there has been an increase in Islamophobia in the United States and other European countries post 9/11. This has been a major issue that's emerged. So democracies do see an increase in intolerance towards particular groups after terrorist incidents. We also see that in a lot of ways, democracy can be more beneficial politically to conservative politicians than to more liberal politicians. Individuals oftentimes will prioritize what they call security, diminishment of individual freedoms, liberties. Conservative politicians are oftentimes labeled as being more concerned with security in many respects, whether that's true or not. This is the label that's often given. And so generally it can be more beneficial to conservative politicians as they promise particular types of action that maybe liberal politicians might not necessarily be willing to do. And then terrorism also has been seen to lead to more hawkish, more militaristic foreign policy. Citizens are much more willing to be favorable towards sending troops abroad, using airstrikes abroad for international terrorist groups after terrorist attacks. So democracies see a greater willingness of individual citizens to support international action and violent international action after terrorist attacks. What else does it do? Well, we also see terrorism can be an effective political issue. Terrorism can come to dominate political debates, especially in the immediate aftermath of a terrorist attack. Politicians will use terrorism as use the fear of another terrorist attack as a motivator to gain support, to try to push particular policies. So we can see terrorism can become a big-time political issue and an effective political issue for particular politicians. We also see that in some ways, maybe a positive outcome is that when there are terrorist attacks, we also see conversely or consequently a increase in voter turnout. So when a democracy has a terrorist attack in close proximity to an election, we see actually greater turnout in those particular elections. And maybe we see this as a reason that these citizens are willing to push back against terrorist aims, want to express their political freedoms without fear of repression by particular terrorist organizations. So we do see an increase in voter turnout in the immediate aftermath of elections, which is unfortunate that it takes that, but it is a positive response to terrorism. And then finally, we also see terrorism can play a major role in facilitating populism. And populism is the political movement that we've seen emerge across Europe, the United States, and really across the world. India is a political movement that really aims to and claims to be a political movement of the people, for the people, but we often see it has quite negative consequences as it picks particular minority groups to castigate as the outgroup. That's the problem of all the issues in a particular country, and creates a very much us versus them mentality in terms of politics. So this is another consequence we see of terrorism in democracies. So your final discussion question 2, is what effects do you think terrorism has had on American democracy? So again, discussion question 2. What effects do you think terrorism has had on American democracy?